"Mom, sign this before dinner gets cold," my oldest son said as he slid a thick stack of papers across the polished oak table. The steak in front of me was still steaming, the butter slowly melting into the mashed potatoes, but no one reached for their fork. I looked down at the first page, transfer of business control. The words were bold, clean, final. I did not touch the pen, I just looked at their faces. Jason sat straight, confident, like he was closing a deal at work. Ryan leaned back, pretending this was casual, like it was just another Sunday dinner, but his fingers kept tapping the edge of his glass. I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I finally understood everything. "I'm glad you're here. I want you to listen carefully, because what happened that night didn't begin at that table. It started more than 40 years ago when I arrived in this country with $312 in my purse and an address scribbled on a folded piece of paper. I was 23. I didn't know anyone in Chicago. I worked double shifts as a waitress. My feet hurt all the time. My English was careful and slow. I memorized phrases from customers. I listened more than I spoke. After a year, I moved to Texas because someone told me there was opportunity here. I didn't even know what that meant. I just knew I needed a chance. I got a job answering phones at a small insurance office, $8.50 an hour. I learned by listening. I stayed late to read policy files. I asked questions nobody wanted to answer. I failed the licensing exam twice before I passed the third time, and when I did, no one congratulated me. They just handed me a list of cold leads and told me good luck. I remember sitting in my car outside a gas station dialing numbers with shaking hands. People hung up on me. They told me I sounded too young, too unsure. Some laughed. I kept going because I had two little boys at home, and no one else was going to build a future for them. Not their father, not anyone else, just me. Years passed. One policy at a time, one client at a time. I built something small and steady, something no one noticed. Because it wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, it was consistent, renewal after renewal, trust after trust, until one day I realized I didn't need the office anymore. I opened my own agency in my garage, a folding table, a second-hand computer, and a phone that never stopped ringing. If you were willing to drive 2 hours to meet a client, if you remembered their kids' names, if you answered calls on weekends, they stayed with you, and they told others. That's how it grew, not overnight, not by luck, but by showing up. Again and again. I looked back at the table. Jason cleared his throat. "Mom, this is just to make things easier going forward," he said. "Easier for who?" I wondered, but I didn't say it out loud. Ryan leaned in. "You've done enough. You should relax. Let us handle things now." I nodded. Slowly, I picked up the first page, not to sign it, just to feel the weight of it. The paper was smooth, expensive, official. They thought they understood what they were holding. They thought it was everything I had built, but they didn't understand the difference between seeing money and knowing how it was earned. I placed the paper back down exactly where it was and took a sip of water. It was the first thing I touched all night, and in that moment, I realized something simple and clear. They weren't asking for my help anymore. They were asking for my life's work, and they had no idea who they were really asking. I did not sign that paper that night. I did not argue either. I folded my napkin, placed it gently beside my plate, and looked at my sons the same way I used to when they were boys, when they were waiting to see if I would say yes or no. The difference now is they were not asking for permission, they were expecting compliance. Jason shifted in his chair and tried to smile, like this was still under control. "Mom, you do not need to think so hard about it," he said. "It is just paperwork. We already talked to a financial advisor. It is the smart move for tax purposes." Ryan nodded quickly. "Yeah, it is about protecting what you built, making sure nothing gets complicated later." I watched them carefully, not their words, but their timing. The way they avoided details, the way they spoke over each other, like they had rehearsed this conversation without me. I reached for my glass again. The water was cold, steady. It grounded me in a moment that suddenly felt very far from family and very close to business, and I knew business better than either of them ever. "Would you talk to an advisor?" I asked quietly. Jason leaned forward, relieved that I was finally engaging. "Yes, we did," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "He is very experienced. He works with families like ours." "Families like ours," I repeated softly. I let that phrase sit between us because I knew exactly what he meant and exactly what he did not understand. They thought success meant visible numbers, the office, the accounts, the monthly statements. They thought if they could access those things, they would own everything, but what they never saw was what actually held it together: the relationships, the renewal structures, the agreements that were never written in simple language. The trust clients had built with me over decades. I glanced at the papers again. The sections were highlighted, carefully prepared. Someone had spent time making this look simple: transfer management, authority, asset consolidation, operational oversight. The words were clean, but I could see the intention behind them clear as day. Jason slid the pen a little closer to me. You can take your time, but we should not delay too long, he said. There are opportunities we do not want to miss. I almost smiled at that. Opportunities. One remembered every opportunity one had ever been offered. Most of them were not opportunities at all. They were shortcuts dressed up as solutions, and shortcuts always came with a cost. I leaned back slightly and looked at both of them. Tell me something, I said. How exactly do you plan to run the agency? When I stepped back, Jason blinked just for a second before answering. Well, we would restructure some things, modernize operations, maybe bring in a management team. Ryan added, we could scale it, expand into new markets. I nodded slowly. They spoke in ideas, not details, and ambition, not experience. They had never sat across from a small business owner who was deciding whether to trust you with their livelihood. They had never driven across counties to renew a policy because a client preferred face-to-face conversation. They had never stayed up late recalculating risk because one mistake could cost someone everything. I placed my hand on the table, not on the papers just beside them. You both think this is about money, I said calmly. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but I continued without raising my voice. This business was never just numbers. It was built on something you cannot transfer with a signature. The room went quiet. Ryan looked down at his glass. Jason leaned back again, his expression tightening slightly as if something had shifted just beyond his control, and for the first time that night I saw it clearly. Not greed, not exactly, but assumption. They assumed I would eventually step aside. They assumed everything I had built would naturally become theirs, and they assumed wrong. I picked up my purse slowly. I am going to need more time, I said, standing up. The chair moved softly against the floor. I did not rush. I did not look angry. I simply stepped away from the table, leaving the papers exactly where they were, untouched, and as I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes on me, confused, maybe even a little unsettled, because what they did not realize yet was that I had already seen this coming years ago, and I had already made sure that no one could take what they never truly understood. I did not go home right away that night. I drove without turning on the radio, just the sound of the engine steady beneath me and the quiet hum of the highway stretching out under the Texas sky. The city lights faded behind me, and for a moment, I let myself sit with the weight of what had just happened. Not the papers, not the request, but the certainty in their voices. They were not asking, they were planning, and that kind of certainty does not come from nowhere. It comes from conversations that happen without you, decisions that are made before you even know there is a decision to be made. I turned into the parking lot of my office. The building looked the same as it always had, 2 stories, brick front, simple sign, nothing flashy, but every inch of it held years of work that no one else could see. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool. The faint smell of paper and coffee still lingered from earlier in the day. I did not turn on all the lights, just the lamp on my desk. It was enough. I sat down slowly and looked at the framed photos on the shelf. My boys, when they were young, missing teeth, scraped knees, big smiles. They used to come here after school, sitting on the floor with coloring books while I finished calls. They used to think this place was something special, not because of money, but because it was ours. I reached for the drawer and pulled out a folder, not the one they had seen, not the one with statements and summaries, but the one behind it, the one that had been there for years, untouched by anyone but me. Inside were copies of agreements, letters, signatures, details that no one had ever asked about because they assumed they already knew the story. But assumptions are dangerous in business, and even more dangerous in family. I opened the first document, the original formation papers for the company, followed by amendments, changes, structures that had evolved over time. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just layers built carefully over decades. Because I learned early that stability is not something you leave to chance, it is something you design. I thought about the first time a client trusted me with their business, a small auto repair shop. The owner had looked at me for a long time before signing the policy, like he was deciding if I would still be there when things went wrong. I had stayed with that client for 23 years, through expansions, through setbacks, through everything. That is what this business was, not numbers, not quick gains, but consistency, trust, relationships that do not transfer just because someone signs a form. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Jason talked about restructuring. Ryan talked about scaling. Neither of them had ever sat across from a client who asked, "Will you still pick up the phone when I call at 6 in the morning?" They had never understood that the value they saw on paper was only a reflection of something much harder to build and much easier to lose. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. I looked at the screen. Jason calling. I let it ring, not out of anger, but because I was not ready to have that conversation yet, not until I understood exactly how far they had gone and how much they thought they already controlled. The call stopped Then a message appeared. "We just want to help mom. Call me when you get this." I read it once, then placed the phone face down. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the empty parking lot. Everything was still quiet, unchanged on the surface, but I knew something had shifted, not in them, but in me. I had spent years building something strong enough to support others. Now I had to make sure it was strong enough to protect itself, because what they had placed in front of me tonight was not just paperwork. It was a line, and once a line is drawn, you do not step over it without knowing exactly what it means. The office was quiet, but not empty. It never really was, even at night, because every file, every folder, every small detail carried something forward into the next day. I turned on one more light near the back hallway and walked slowly past the desks. Denise always kept hers organized, neat stacks of files, color-coded tabs, a small plant by the monitor. She had been with me for 18 years, longer than most marriages last. She had seen things grow from nothing, and she had never once asked for more than what she earned. I paused at her desk and noticed something different, not messy, just slightly disturbed. A drawer not fully closed, a file shifted out of line, small things that most people would not notice. But I had built a career noticing small things, because in this business the smallest detail could cost everything. I reached down and gently pulled the drawer open. Inside were client files. Nothing unusual at first glance, but then I saw it, a folder I did not recognize, labeled renewal projections, not the standard format we use. This one had been printed recently, the paper still crisp. I flipped it open slowly. Page after page of detailed breakdowns, client names, premium values, commission structures, projected revenue over 5 years. This was not internal preparation, this was valuation material, the kind of report you create when you are preparing to sell or transfer a business. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back exactly where it had been. My hand rested on the edge of the desk for a moment, steady, calm. This confirmed what I already suspected but had not yet seen clearly. They were not just asking for control, they were preparing to move fast. I walked back to my office and sat down again. The chair felt different now, not heavier, just more certain. I opened my laptop and logged into the system. The familiar screen appeared. Client database, policy tracking, commission flow, everything exactly as I had designed it years ago. I navigated quietly, checking access logs, nothing dramatic, no alarms. But there it was, late night entries, files opened, reports generated, times that did not match our normal workflow. Someone had been here after hours, or had remote access through someone who did. I did not rush, I did not panic. I simply noted the pattern and closed the system. The phone rang again. This time it was Ryan. I watched the screen light up, his name appearing steady, persistent. I let it ring until it stopped. Then another message came through. "We are just trying to make things easier for you, Mom. You do not have to handle all of this alone." I read the words carefully. Easier for you, that phrase again, the same language Jason had used earlier, the same tone of concern that hides something else underneath. Not cruelty, not exactly, but convenience. They wanted to simplify something they had never truly carried. I stood up again and walked toward the small cabinet in the corner of my office. Inside were older records, not digital, not easily accessed, things that required intention to retrieve. I opened it and pulled out a second folder, thicker, older, worn at the edges. This one held agreements that no one had asked about because they assumed everything important was already visible, but I had learned long ago that what protects you is rarely what people expect to find. I placed the folder on my desk and opened it slowly. Inside were signed documents dated years apart, each one part of a structure built piece by piece, not to hide anything, but to ensure that nothing could be taken apart without understanding how it was built. I leaned back in my chair again and allowed myself a small quiet breath. This was no longer about whether I would sign those papers, it was about understanding exactly how far they were willing to go and whether they believed I would ever look closely enough to see it. The office remained still, the same walls, the same desks, the same quiet presence of work done over decades. But now there was a difference, not in the space, but in the purpose, because what they had started without telling me had already reached further than a simple conversation at dinner, and I knew that whatever came next would not be decided at a table with plates and polite words. It would be decided here, where everything real had been built. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the parking lot was still empty. The air carried that quiet stillness that only comes before a long day begins. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, turning on only the lights I needed, one by one, like I always had for years. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. I set my purse down and went straight to my desk, not to start work, but to prepare. I opened the folder again, the older one, the one that held the pieces no one had asked about, and laid The documents out carefully across the surface. Each page told part of the story, not the version my sons believed, but the one that had actually been built over time. I checked the dates, the signatures, the clauses. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. I had not looked at some of these documents in years because I never needed to, but I always knew they were there just in case. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in a while. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Calm, professional, unchanged. Eleanor, it has been a long time. What can I do for you today? He said. I allowed myself a small pause before answering. I need to review everything I said, not rushed, not emotional, just clear. There was no surprise in his response. Of course, he said. When would you like to come? And I looked at the clock. It was just after 7 this morning. I said, I will be there by 9. We ended the call without extra words. We never needed them. I placed the phone down and sat back for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. This was not the first time I had to protect something I built. It was just the first time I had to do it for my own family, and that required a different kind of clarity, not anger, not disappointment, just understanding. Denise arrived a little after 8. She stopped when she saw me already at my desk. You are here early, she said, her tone light, but her eyes searching. She had always been observant. I nodded. I wanted to get a head start, I said. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. There was something else she wanted to say. I could see it in the way she held her hands in front of her, careful, controlled. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, she said quietly. I gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. It will not take long, she continued. I noticed some unusual activity in the system last night. Files being accessed, reports being generated, not by our normal process. I listened without interrupting. I know you probably already saw it, she added, but I thought you should hear it from me. I gave a small nod. Thank you, Denise, I said, and I meant it not just for the information, but for the way she chose to bring it to me directly, without assumption, without hesitation. She looked relieved, then slightly concerned. Is everything all right? She asked. I paused for a moment, considering the question. Everything is exactly what it needs to be, I replied calmly. She studied my face for a second, then nodded slowly, understanding more than I had said. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She did not need everything explained to recognize when something mattered. After she returned to her desk, I gathered the documents into a single folder and placed them neatly inside my briefcase. I took one last look around the office, the desks, the files, the quiet rhythm of a place built on routine and trust. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had shifted. The line that had been drawn the night before was now clear, and the next step was no longer a question of whether I would respond, but how I would do it. I picked up my keys and walked toward the door, locking it behind me. As I stepped into the morning light, the day had officially begun, and so had the part of the story they never saw coming. I arrived at the office just before 9. The building where my attorney worked had not changed in over 20 years. The same marble floors, the same quiet lobby, the same receptionist who greeted me with a small professional smile, as if time moved differently in places like this. I signed in and took a seat near the window, my briefcase resting beside me. I did not check my phone. I did not review the documents again. I had already done that. What mattered now was confirmation, not discovery. After a few minutes, I was escorted down the hallway into a familiar conference room. He was already there, standing near the table, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when I entered and gave a slight nod. Eleanor, he said, it is good to see you. I returned the greeting calmly and placed my briefcase on the table. We did not waste time. I opened the folder and slid the documents across to him. I need you to walk me through everything as if we are starting from the beginning, I said. He understood immediately that this was not routine. He adjusted his glasses and began reviewing each page carefully, not quickly, not casually. He moved through them with the same precision he had always used when we worked together years ago. The room remained quiet, except for the sound of paper turning. After a few minutes, he looked up. Everything here is intact, he said. The structure is exactly as we designed it. The limited liability company, the trust, the separation of operational control and asset ownership. None of this can be altered without your authorization. I listened without interrupting, not because I doubted him, but because I needed to hear it said clearly in this room with nothing assumed. If someone were to attempt to take control, I asked, keeping my tone even. He leaned back, slightly considering the question. They would need access that they do not have, and even if they tried to create leverage through documentation, it would not hold legally. The agreements are layered deliberately. No single document grants full authority. I nodded slowly. That was what I had expected, but expectation is not the same as certainty, and certainty matters when decisions are about to be made. He closed the folder gently and looked at Me directly. Has something happened? He asked. I allowed a brief pause before answering. Something has begun, I said. That was enough. He did not press further. He did not need to. He had seen situations like this before, just not always within families. If you're concerned about internal pressure, he continued, there are options. We can reinforce operational boundaries, formalize leadership roles, and restrict access at a higher level. I considered that for a moment, not because I had not already thought of it, but because hearing it framed in legal terms made the next steps clearer. I want everything reviewed and updated, I said. Every agreement, every access point, every clause that protects this business. He nodded without hesitation. We can start immediately, he replied. I checked the time briefly. It was just past 10. The day outside was already moving forward, traffic building, people heading into meetings, making decisions that felt important in the moment, but I knew what we were doing here carried a different kind of weight. I gathered the documents back into the folder and secured them in my briefcase before standing there. As one more thing, I added, I want a formal meeting scheduled. I will let you know when and who will be present. He understood the meaning behind that as well. This was no longer preparation, it was positioning. I thanked him and left the room, walking back through the quiet hallway toward the lobby. This same receptionist looked up as I passed, offering the same polite smile. Nothing in this building had changed, but everything outside of it had already shifted. When I stepped into the sunlight, I felt something settle, not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that comes when you know exactly where you stand and exactly what comes next. I opened my car door, placed the briefcase inside, and paused for a moment before getting in, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting. I was moving forward on my own terms, and they would not recognize it until it was already too late. The drive back from the attorney office felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because my thoughts were no longer scattered. Everything had settled into place like pieces of a structure I had built years ago, finally being seen clearly again. I did not turn on the radio. I did not rush. I simply followed the road back to the office, knowing that what waited there was no longer routine, it was the next step. When I walked in, Denise looked up immediately, her expression calm but attentive as always. Everything all right? She asked. I gave a small nod. Everything is clear, I said, and that was enough for her. She returned to her work without another question. That was the kind of trust you do not explain. It is built slowly and quietly, just like everything else here. I went straight to my office, closed the door gently behind me, and sat down. The folder rested in my briefcase untouched. Since the meeting, I did not need to open it again. I already knew what it confirmed. Instead, I turned on my computer and began reviewing access permissions line by line, not because something was broken, but because I wanted to reinforce what was already strong. Every system has a foundation, and if you built it correctly, you do not wait for it to crack, you maintain it before anything shifts. I adjusted administrative roles, restricted certain report generations, and added an additional layer of approval for any data export. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the outside, just quiet changes that ensured control remained exactly where it belonged. As I worked, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Jason, followed by Ryan. Their messages came one after the other. We need to talk, Mom. This cannot wait. Just let us explain. I read them once and placed the phone aside, not ignoring them, just choosing the timing of my response, because timing is everything in business and in family. I finished what I was doing before standing up and walking back out to the main office. Denise glanced up again. We are scheduling a meeting, I said. Simply, her eyes narrowed slightly in understanding. When should I block the calendar? She asked. Tomorrow afternoon, I replied. Include everyone? She nodded without hesitation, already reaching for her keyboard. There was no confusion, no need for further detail. She understood what that meant. I walked toward the front of the office and looked out through the glass. The day had moved forward, cars passing, people going about their routines. Nothing in the outside world reflected what was about to happen inside these walls, and that was how it should be. Real decisions rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly until the moment they are revealed. I returned to my office and sat down again, this time allowing myself a brief pause, not to question anything, but to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place. The night before, I had been presented with something they believed was inevitable. Today I had confirmed that it was not, and tomorrow would be where that difference became visible. I picked up my phone finally and opened Jason's message again. I typed a short response: meeting tomorrow at the office, be there at 2. I did not add anything else, no explanation, no reassurance, no emotion. I sent the message and placed the phone down. The room was still the same desk, the same chair, the same view, but there was a clarity now that had not been there before, because I was no longer Wondering what they intended to do, I knew, and more importantly, I knew exactly how it would end, not with raised voices, not with arguments, but with something far more final, something they would not be able to negotiate or reinterpret. Once they saw it for themselves, the next day arrived without urgency, but with a kind of quiet weight that settles before something final takes place. I was already in the office by 1:30, the conference room prepared, not with anything dramatic, just a clean table, a few chairs, and a single folder placed neatly in front of my seat. Denise had arranged everything exactly as I expected. No extra papers, no distractions, just space for what needed to be said. I sat down and waited, not restless, not anxious, just present. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard the front door open, followed by familiar voices. Jason first, his tone controlled, but tight. Ryan just behind him, trying to sound more relaxed than he felt. They stepped into the conference room and paused slightly when they saw the setup. No food, no casual atmosphere, just a table and 3 chairs. Mom, Jason said, attempting a smile. You did not have to make this so formal. I returned the expression calmly. I think it is exactly what it needs to be, I replied, gesturing for them to sit. They exchanged a quick glance before taking their seats. Jason leaned forward almost immediately. We just want to make sure everything is handled the right way, he began. Yesterday might have felt sudden, but we are thinking long-term here. Ryan nodded. Yeah, this is about protecting you, protecting the business. I listened without interrupting, letting them finish, because sometimes people reveal more when they believe they are still in control. When they were done, I reached for the folder in front of me and opened it slowly, not to create tension, but to establish clarity. These are the documents you wanted me to sign, I said, placing them between us. Jason nodded quickly. Yes, that is right. We had everything reviewed. It is standard, nothing unusual. I gave a small nod. I am sure you believe that, I replied, my voice steady. Then I turned the folder slightly and placed another set of documents beside it, older, thicker, the edges worn from time. These, however, are the documents that actually define this business. I watched their expressions shift, not dramatically, but enough confusion first, then uncertainty. Jason frowned slightly. What do you mean, he asked. I did not rush my explanation. I opened the first page and slid it toward them. This is the original structure of the company, I said, followed by amendments over the years, each one building on the last, separating ownership from operations, defining authority in a way that cannot be transferred. Casually, Ryan leaned in, scanning the page, his confidence beginning to fade. Jason remained still, his eyes moving more carefully now, as if he was trying to understand something that no longer fit his expectations. You cannot just sign this over, he said finally, not a question, more a realization. I met his gaze directly. No, I cannot, I said calmly, because it was never designed that way. The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. Ryan sat back slightly, his hands resting on the table as if he needed something solid to hold on to. Jason looked down at the papers again, then back at me. So what happens now, he asked, the certainty in his voice gone, replaced by something more cautious. I closed the folder gently and placed my hands on the table. What happens now is that you understand something, I said. This business is not a number on a page. It is not an account to be transferred. It is a structure built over time, and it does not move just because someone decides it should. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the realization settling in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a shift they could not undo. I stood up then, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the conversation had reached its point. This meeting was never about signing anything, I added. It was about clarity. I looked at both of them once more, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something far more final, understanding. And as I stepped away from the table, I knew they had finally seen what they should have understood long before. Not everything that looks simple can be taken, and not everything that is built can be claimed. No one spoke after I stood up. The silence stayed in the room longer than any words could have. Jason looked down at the documents again, as if reading them a second time might change what they meant. Ryan shifted in his chair, his posture no longer relaxed, his confidence replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. I did not rush to leave. I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the parking lot, the same way I had done so many times before when making decisions that could not be undone. This place had never been just an office. It had been a foundation, something steady when everything else felt unpredictable. I turned back toward them and saw them differently now, not as the boys I had raised, not as the men they believed themselves to be, but as two people who had misunderstood something important for a very long time. Jason finally spoke. So that is it, he asked, his voice measured, but lower than before. You are just not going to let us be part of this? I considered his words carefully, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted him to hear it clearly. I have always let you be part of my life, I said calmly, but this was never something you built with me. Ryan looked up at that, his expression shifting. Slightly as if he wanted to argue but could not find the right place to begin. This is family, he said after a moment. This should stay in the family. I nodded once, because I understood what he meant, and also what he did not. Family is not defined by access, I replied. It is defined by understanding and respect. Neither of them responded immediately. The words settled in the space between us, not as an accusation, but as a fact that did not require agreement. Jason leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if something inside him had adjusted. Not acceptance, not fully, but recognition that the outcome was no longer in his control. What are you going to do then? He asked. I walked back to the table and rested my hand lightly on the folder. Not to protect it, just to acknowledge it. I have already made arrangements, I said. The structure remains intact. The operations will continue exactly as they should, and leadership will stay with the people who understand how to carry it forward. I saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. Denise, he said quietly. I gave a small nod. She has earned that responsibility, not because she asked for it, but because she never needed to. Ryan looked down at the table again, his hands still now no longer tapping, no longer searching for something to hold on to. Jason did not look surprised, just thoughtful in a way that suggested he was finally seeing something he had overlooked for years. I picked up my purse and stepped back from the table. This was never about taking something away, I added. It was about making sure nothing is lost, because it was never as simple as you believed. I walked toward the door and paused for just a moment, not to wait for a response, but to give them space to understand what had just happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. When I stepped out into the hallway, the office felt the same as it always had. Steady, quiet, grounded. The work would continue, the clients would be served, the structure would hold, and for the first time in a long while I felt something settle. Not relief, not victory, just alignment, the kind that comes when everything stands exactly where it was meant to stand. I did not look back as I walked past the front desk and out into the afternoon light, because there was nothing behind me that needed to be revisited. Everything important was already moving forward exactly as it should.